Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network, and today we are back for another interesting interview, a deep dive into a topic that I actually haven't covered before on my channel. In all the years that I've been doing this, we've talked about directed energy weapons, weather modification, and the ways they're used, but I've never spoken about specific incidents, whether that's California fires, or as we're going to cover today, the 2023 fires in Hawaii. I just haven't made the time for it. It's not that I'm not open to this idea. I just really haven't had time to dive into it. So instead of me poking at it, I've decided to bring on some folks who I think are maybe more experts than myself and might have some information that you really want to know about, because I do think this topic, if what we are going to hear about today is accurate, absolutely does pertain to everybody all over the world. And for the future agendas that we know are ongoing, this is an important piece of the puzzle. So with all that said, I want to welcome my old friend Shane Buell on the show and new friend Traci Derwin, who had me on her podcast recently. Thank you guys for joining me here.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks for having us on today.
Yes, thanks for giving us this opportunity.
Yeah, I know that you've been wanting to talk about this for a while, and it's like I said, it's an important topic to me. It's just not one that I'm super versed in. So rather than me trying to figure it out, let's go ahead and talk about the work you guys have done, and starting with your book, which of course is going to be in the show notes. If everybody wants to pick up a copy, highly recommend it, themauibook.com. And it's all about, as I said, the fires that have taken place, and I think not only what initially took place, and as it shows here, the book's broken down into 3 parts. It's not only about what initially took place, but also what has taken place since then, and sort of where we can go from this. And what I care most about, solutions, like what actions people can actually take if they are concerned about these things, not only as a conspiracy theory to explore, but as a real world event that is going to impact people. So why don't you guys give me first, before we get into the book, since this is the first time on the program here, give everybody a little bit of your backgrounds and just maybe how you guys ended up getting connected and working on this project together.
All right. Well, I was actually doing a beauty channel. So my YouTube channel was about makeup and beauty and makeup brushes. And when I heard about the fires in Maui, I'm from Hawaii. So it really struck a chord with me because I have a personal connection to the people there and to the land there. And Hawaii is a very special place. When you go there, it's not just any old vacation. It's just very unique. It's one of the most, isolated areas in the world. So when I heard about all the things going on, it really kind of launched me into talking about it. And I put a couple of videos out, and my videos went viral. And so that's kind of my launching pad into this topic. And since then, so that was about, I think like 19, 20 months ago. Since then, I just continued to look more into it, and I found out so much more. So this rabbit hole has turned out to be a very, very deep one. But I'm so glad that I was able to wake up, because this is my awakening. That was my awakening moment. And I was more familiar with the culture, the political, social, economic aspects of what happened. But the part that I was lacking was the scientific physics. When I started looking at the aftermath, seeing that things weren't normal. This wasn't a normal, wildfire, as they called it. So I got in touch with Shane. Shane actually found me and was able to explain some things that I had been really trying to figure out, especially the military aspect of this and the scientific side. So he was able to kind of balance things out. And together we've been able to provide a more comprehensive explanation of what happened. So Shane, you want to give a little background on how you know all these things that you know?
Okay, sure. So I guess when I was growing up, I was always into physics and science fiction, and I was a Star Trek fan, and so I kind of independently studied physics as a teen. But prior to that, while I was growing up, I actually lived on the same street with a family from Lahaina. I was friends with Mike and Nick Kamaka, whose, like I said, family came from Lahaina, and they were the ones who actually originally told me about Lahaina. So I guess late on the 8th, maybe early on the 9th, Nick had posted something when he found out about Lahaina. And so then I started looking into it, and I found out, that it was a really quick moving fire. People had to jump into the water. And so I started digging into it and looking more and more into it. And I found out what really sparked my curiosity into this whole Maui situation was the video that Eric West did when he discovered that Fish was still alive. So Fish is one of his friends, is his nickname. And he ran into him, and the quote that Fish had said when he was recounting his story was that he had walked out on foot, and there was a roadblock where the police were keeping the cars from leaving. And he had stopped and talked to the cop, and he said, you know, why are you blocking the road? And he's like, oh, I have orders to keep them here. And that kind of enraged me, really. And so I started really digging into it, and I found all kinds of evidence. I'm going to rewind a little. So I did pay a little bit of attention after the Paradise Fire. We actually do have a mutual friend, I believe, that lives in Northern California, who had posted some photos of the Paradise aftermath. And to me, it looked really strange because there was melted metal and melted glass. And then I saw those very same things again in Maui. And sometimes you would even see a car with, you know, melted rims and melted windshield that was right next to or right underneath a tree that was relatively untouched. And so I really started looking into this. And so there's so many factors in this Maui fire disaster that really stick out like a sore thumb to me.
Shane, real quick, before we get into the theories, why don't we let's take a one step back and first, thank you guys for introducing yourself and for all the work you guys have done on this. But before we get further into the theories, let's just remind everybody, what is the mainstream version of events? Like, what did, you know, the mainstream news say happened, and what is their explanation? All those sort of details before we share what you guys have found.
Okay, I could kind of give you guys a gist of what the mainstream narrative is that because of climate change, non-native grasses were more prone to being burned. It was all dried out. It hadn't rained. There was a drought. And so this fire, did they ever explain exactly the ignition? I don't know if they ever properly, I think they said power lines, you know, just fell, and that's why these fires sparked up. I think that's the official narrative.
Allegedly, it was the power line at the Mauka end of Lahaina Luna Road. Yeah.
Right. Is there any truth to the drought part of that?
I mean, the west side of Maui is historically drier, but just from being from Hawaii, it's never that dry. There is a significant amount of humidity in the air. As a child, I used to try to start fires, and it's extremely difficult. So the idea that the whole town burned down was just really weird. And the fact that structures were so heavily affected is not normal, even till, you know, the current ones. But the official death count, I think, is 102 or 104, which is vastly lower than what it actually is. And it's, I think, just basically climate change and the winds, and the hurricane that they said was causing these winds was actually 600 miles away, but it was basically the hurricane caused these winds. The dryness allowed the power lines to cause a fire, and the town burned down.
And Shane, as far as the source that you said they claimed, has the police or government or anything like that ever put forth anything that you feel is substantial to prove that the power line?
Well, so the Attorney General has done a report on this, and they did an entire investigation, and they did find that the fire seemed to have started near the power lines at the I guess you could say the northeastern end of Lahaina Luna Road, which is Mauka, or above. It's up the mountain. And there was some video that showed power lines were down in that area when the fire started. However, you know, I've had other people from Maui that sent me that same video, and they've analyzed different areas. They showed how not only is the area where the power line was touching the ground, not only is that on fire, but also the area where the fence is touching the ground has also caught fire. And there was a lot of things that had caught fire that were, like, I guess, upwind of the original fire. And so, you know, the embers would travel with the wind. However, there were places that caught fire that were behind the initial start of the fire. And we've seen how the fire did seem to move against the wind in a few different instances.
And also, there were 2 fires earlier that day in a different part of the island that could not have, the embers could not have traveled all the way to Lahaina. So there were 3 actual fires that started. So again, very unusual that many fires started at around the same time. So the power line theory doesn't really hold water because those other two fires were not started by down power lines. In fact, the area, Kula doesn't have their power lines are underground, so that would.
And as far as like the actual the outcome, it's so you said there ends up being multiple fires, thousands of buildings burned. They say at least 100 people killed. You argue more than that. Talk about that again before we get into the theories as far as the total destruction that took place.
All right. Well, there was 2 fires earlier in a different part of the island, but no one lost their life there, and I think a handful of structures burned there. But I think the approximate number is 1,200 structures, and the actual area is fairly small. It was very kind of isolated to one little area, the main fire at least. I don't know, Shane, did you have anything else?
Well, so the winds were actually not consistent across the island, and I probably will get into that when I talk more about weather modification. However, so like the other fires in Kula and Olinda, those appear to have been started just prior to the Maui fire, and it may have actually diverted resources, which could have possibly been an intention behind that. So there were different areas of the island that had different wind speeds, and the area of Kula, for example, which caught fire, not only didn't have as significant of wind, but like Traci said, the power lines were actually located underground. So in my opinion, the ignition source of the Kula fire must be something completely different than a down power line.
But I will say the many other abnormalities or anomalies are what really sealed the deal for me. So if you want, I can go into why this is such an unusual event and why it's kind of the blueprint for these suspicious fires we're seeing.
Yeah, because I know that you guys and many others, like I said, I didn't look at it deeply, but I've seen the videos going across the feeds, point to directed energy weapons and different types of weather modifications. So and obviously the reason people do that is because of, I think, what you're about to get into, Traci, which is these different anomalies that what people speculate a typical fire wouldn't do or couldn't, leave these sort of traces. So feel free to take us in that direction.
Okay, well, one thing that was very unusual, and I know this because I lived in Hawaii for the beginning part of my life, is the sirens never went off. And Hawaii has a very robust siren system. And the excuse for why they didn't sound the alarm is because they didn't want people to think a tsunami was coming, which that doesn't make sense because it's pretty obvious if a tsunami is coming. And the siren system is built to warn people of other events such as wildfires or forest fires. Also, there were no water in the hydrants to put the fire out. That's very unusual. Hawaii has a very sophisticated infrastructure, so there should have been enough water in the hydrants to put the fire out. Also, the police blocked the roads going out of the area that was burning. That, again, is very unusual. They should have been blocking people from coming into the area. And we do see a lot of evidence of people that stayed in their car and lost their life or ran from their car and ran into the water. Some of them survived, but some did not. And the unusual, lack of response from the military and the officials. Pearl Harbor is not too far away. They could have had a helicopter come over in 20 or 30 minutes. But there was virtually no military response while the fire was going on. In fact, it took days for significant support and rescue helicopters to come and help out. So there was just this lag, this lack of support. And it was just from the beginning, very, very fishy as far as the reports that people were saying. I could also go into more of the political aspects that make this very unusual. Governor Green, 3 weeks before the fire, he wrote an emergency proclamation, which would bypass the building codes in the event of a natural disaster. Now, these proclamations are usually written after the natural disaster, not before. So this proclamation gave him the right to not, preserve the cultural structures, and because Hawaii is full of old buildings, cemeteries, areas where Native Hawaiians had their heiaus, which were like sacred areas where they buried their dead. So with this proclamation, they didn't have to honor those rules.
Is that seen by some as a sign of foreknowledge? Like somebody may have, known something was going to happen, so this declaration gets put forth ahead of time.
That's a big sign.
As far as the you mentioned the fire hydrants and the alarm not going off, have the officials offered any explanations as to those events, or do they even acknowledge them?
Well, the guy that was in charge of the sirens said that he decided not to because he thought people were going to run towards the fire because they thought a tsunami was coming. But anyone that lives there know that that's just kind of unusual. It's just a really poor excuse. And the water, that whole thing, it kind of brought in a lot of different topics like the water rights. But they used one guy, Kaleo Manuel, they used him as a scapegoat, saying that he turned off the water. But I don't have any evidence that he has the power to do that or that he actually did it. He was just kind of the scapegoat for why there was no water in the hydrants. It is possible that the directed energy caused the pipes, the metal pipes, to burn, and so there was no water pressure, but it could have been someone above him did make it so that there was no water available. Also, people in their homes prior to the fire did lose water pressure. But yeah, we never got exactly the true answer for why that happened. But I could.
So it seems like in some ways this is just starting to remind me of nearly every other major, whether you want to call them false flags or just government operations, where everything seems to go wrong in one day, and discussions of potential foreknowledge that something was going to happen. And I know there's also a financial aspect to this as well. But yeah, let's continue on. And Shane, I know you wanted to share about the technology, like how this could happen. So you guys take it in whatever direction you like.
Okay.
So
well,
yeah,
really
I mean,
quick, I could just before I forget, there was also missing satellite images of right before the fire started, and Shane's going to go into the unusual winds and cloud formations, and I guess just we'll go into this. I'll let Shane kind of go into this, but the ever-changing death count, the changing number of missing, and just the lack of transparency. Also, something that has kind of arisen again is this police chief that was in charge and who was on the island that day. So the governor was out of state. The mayor his whereabouts were unknown. The fire chief was on the mainland. The Ndaya, who was the Maui emergency management director, was off island. The only, I guess, main official was the police chief. And when I dug into his background, there was a lot of fishy stuff going on there. And more recently, he's been named in a complaint in one of the Diddy cases. So again, his name keeps coming up. He was also the person who wrote the after action report for the shooting in Vegas at the Mandalay Resort. So a lot of things.
I did see that recently. So, kind of maybe somebody who's used in different operations like this who can be trusted to play his role, something to that effect.
Yes, that's what it's turning out. But I'll let Shane go into the more, I guess, scientific aspects of what was uncovered after the fire.
Okay. Yeah, before I get into that, I just wanted to comment on how they've called it a perfect storm of conditions or circumstances that led up to the disaster. And it seemed like it was just everything that could have gone wrong did, not just before and during, but also after. And the more and more we dig into that, the more intentional that appears to be. All right. So, yeah, I do want to, I guess, go back into directed energy now. And so, a lot of us have probably heard about directed energy from like maybe the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was trying to implement the Star Wars program for missile defense. And back in the 1980s, like around 1986, they had determined that it's not viable. It's not at the stage that it needs to be. to be, useful. And so then they kind of said that they stopped working on it. And so throughout the 80s and 90s, a lot of the American public just assumed that Star Wars was abandoned. Well, then, actually, let me go to my screen share real quick. If you could go ahead and put that on the screen. Yeah, so as early as 1970, the United States government had investigated forest fire as a military weapon. And so they've been looking into the conditions that, can help produce forest fire. And so they've, ever since 1970, this was a declassified report that was, I guess, originally classified, but now it's not. And they go into a lot of detail, and you do see some airplanes in the in this image that show like what looks like it could be stratospheric aerosol injection of some sort. And the document actually does mention things like that. So they talk about desiccants, and they talk about, different types of fires and how to generate them. And this is more just, by hand, by arson. However, they've taken what they've learned from this document, and they've definitely expanded upon it since then. All right, so now I want to go to another document. This is a United States patent from 2002, and it's titled Microwave Transmission Using a Laser-Generated Plasma Beam Waveguide. And what this does is it has a laser that's main purpose is to ionize the air through which the beam travels. Now, the reason they do this is because microwaves are reflective so like ionized air will be electrically conductive, and any electrically conductive material will reflect microwaves. So they arrange these lasers into a ring formation, and they create like a hollow tube or tunnel which can contain the microwaves and actually like pipe it to its location. And the laser is only there to ionize the air to act as a waveguide to guide the microwaves to its location. Now, typically a laser is a very straight, narrow beam, and typically microwaves or radio waves or other types of frequencies will spread out in a conical formation like you see at the bottom. However, when you contain the microwave inside of a laser beam, then you can now limit the rate of spread of the cone, and you can also limit the collateral damage that's done by the microwave. I think this is how we're able to see microwave effects that are limited to a very small area. All right, then in 2016, the United States Congress passed a bill called the Directed Energy Weapons Systems Acquisition Act of 2016. And what this does is it frees up a lot more money to put into directed energy weapons, because they saw that directed energy weapon technology was becoming more mature. However, despite all the money they've thrown into it since, like, say, the 60s or 70s, they needed to fund it at much higher levels to be able to meet the benchmarks that they were looking at. So they passed this, acquisition act that allowed them a lot more, like I think $6 billion at least worth of money to throw into directed energy research. Okay, so then this is actually a picture that I got from Chile. I do have pictures from other fires here because we do have other fires that I believe are due fires. And the reason that I think this picture is relevant is because when you see the pallet that's sitting next to the car, it looks like the pallet is only burned up until about 2 or 3 feet from the car. And then there's like a pretty distinct line where it actually stops burning. And to me, that's actually representative of radiative heat versus, say, convective or conductive heat. So I don't believe that it was a combustive flame that actually touched the pallet and caught it on fire. I believe
that's a pretty strong image right there. I mean, you can see almost even where you're pointing at the pallet, but then going up, it like looks almost like a straight square, like just like a line from there as well. You can see like a outline, like right next to the dog as well. It sort of stops right there.
Yeah. So I believe what was happening is that the car itself was on fire or being struck, and then the heat that was radiating away from the car was only radiative heat. It wasn't necessarily combustion or convective heat that was actually catching that pallet on fire. And then the other thing I want to point out is this, it's actually like one of those 5-gallon plastic water bottles, which is actually sitting right next to the car. This could have been placed there afterwards, but it's likely, due to the nature of the fire and how soon they came in and, blocked everything off, it's unlikely that the owners had actually returned to this property at the time that this photo was taken. So it is a pretty good chance that that water bottle actually was sitting there at the time. Now, plastic is microwave safe, and it's also blue, so there's that. which I will get into here shortly.
Well, Shane, let me ask a question
Yeah.
real quick.
Go
So
ahead.
to go back to the previous slide where you had the laser with the microwave. So do they, in discussions, whether it's DARPA or others who've studied directed energy weapons, they talk about using microwave as the source of the weapon?
There are several sources actually that go into high-powered microwaves. I think I do have something here I can show you. No, maybe this isn't it. Okay, it's in a different slide, different set of slides, but I do have some information.
Well,
that
I'm
shows...
asking. The reason I'm asking just real quick is because you were describing in the other one that like if you put a microwave contained within a laser, then you could have a more focused instead of it being kind of spread out. So would the general idea be there that if a microwave is being used as a directed energy weapon, that it's inside of a laser to get this sort of targeted, focus like you're showing in that picture there? Is that the general idea?
So being inside the laser, it contains the spread of the microwave beam to being within the laser. And yes, that makes it much more targetable, but it also decreases the amount of collateral damage, like we saw with the car in Chile. So the car was struck by what appears to be perhaps a directed energy weapon, but the collateral damage doesn't spread more than just like 2 or 3 feet from the actual car.
And I was just going to say there's like pallets, like wood that's untouched, which that should be more flammable than a metal car.
Yeah, you would think if this was a flame that was driven by convection and combustion, that it would consume the entire length of the fuel before, going out. However, there was still fuel present when the flames stopped burning.
Yeah, and that you mean like it should have just kept burning that pallet and then gone on to the next pallet and continued to burn out.
Yeah, you would think as long as there's fuel for the flames, then it would continue to burn until the fuel is burned up.
Great. Okay, go ahead and continue. Yeah, this is really interesting. I hadn't seen the forest fire as a weapon, man. That's a great find.
Yeah, and that's from 1970, and I'm sure that they've made advances since then, at least 50 years worth. This is a car that's also from Chile, and you can see what looks like the glass from the back window is now draped across the trunk. And the reason I show this is because a lot of people, they see cars without glass and they're like, oh, maybe the glass broke, because sometimes glass does break in a fire. When the glass gets too hot, sometimes it will shatter. However, what we see many, many times is that, the glass actually melts as one piece. And you can see that this back window here is just draped across the back, back of the trunk, but it's almost draped like a cloth or something. So it looks like it melted all as one piece. And I just wanted to show that. And the melting point of glass is about 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit for auto glass. And the highest temperature that they've recorded in a forest fire is around 1,400 degrees. Some forms of pine can burn at like 1479, but that's about the highest temperature that you could ever achieve from a natural forest fire. All right, and then this is also from Chile.
The same Chile fire? Are these all from the same incident, or these different?
These all happen to be from Chile. I will also show some Maui damage, but some of the examples from Chile are also very striking, and that's why I included those here.
But are they from different fires or the same fire?
No, this is all from the same fire in Chile that was last February in 2024. It was near the end of February. They had a fire that broke out between Valparaiso and Viña del Mar, Chile. And Viña del Mar, it just so happens, is also slated to be a smart city. And this area of Chile also is very rich in lithium mineral deposits. All right. Okay, so this is also another picture from Chile, which shows the amount of destruction of these structures. So there is any structure that's destroyed is pretty much completely destroyed, and it's been reduced into its footprint of like a white ash substance. And you don't see a whole lot of gray or black, which you would normally see in a combustive fire, which would leave behind a lot of charcoal soot. The carbon that's left behind usually leaves like a gray or blackish tint, which we don't see a lot of here. And most of these structures that are destroyed have been reduced to a fine, powdery white ash, which to me is evidence of something called calcination, which is a very high heat, but without passing through the combustion phase. There are a few other structures that we see that look untouched. One has like a blue roof, and there's some red there. And I will get into the color scheme a little bit later. Now, this actually is from Lahaina, and this is the Lahaina Pentecostal Church, the roof of which appears to have been like sliced down the center. And a lot of people thought this was evidence of a laser beam. However, to me, this is actually evidence of what I call electromagnetic induction. And the reason I say that is because there was a power line that ran across the ceiling. It was the wiring for the light fixture, which let's see, I don't have the picture handy, but there was, where you see the wire hanging down on the left there, there was a light fixture in the middle of this section of the roof that actually was covered, like the wiring was covered with a 4x4, and then there was a light fixture mounted in the center. Now, if this structure was struck by a microwave beam, microwaves would induce eddy currents in any metals that they strike. So like the wiring of the building of the structure would actually have currents induced through it. And so what I believe happened was that this structure was struck by microwaves, which induced currents through the wiring that caused resistive heating and then, burning of the adjacent, flammable materials. Now, this is the 4x4 beam that was across the ceiling, and you can see that it has fallen, and it has actually fallen onto the podium, and it did not catch the podium on fire. It didn't even catch the paperwork down there on fire, because once it fell away from the metal wire, it was no longer being energized by the proximity, because the proximity to the wire is what actually transmits the energy. And it's a radiative heat, and radiative heat is governed by the inverse square law, which dictates that the radiation is equal to the inverse of the square of the distance from the source. And so if you count the electrical wiring as the source of the radiative heat, then once the beam fell just a few inches away, then it was no longer being energized by that source.
And really quick, I did want to point out there, you can't see it that well in this photo, but that on the left, that is a orchid. And I've seen better pictures. It was in perfect shape. It wasn't even dried out, which is unusual if there was a fire in there.
Yeah, this is probably a lower quality image that was taken from a video, maybe 720p. I'm not really sure. But yeah, this is a close-up of the wiring in the ceiling. And you can see that the ceiling was only damaged within an inch or two of the wiring. And to me, that's a signature of radiative heat that was caused by electromagnetic induction. All right. And then, so there's the light fixture that you can see. There's on the other end.
All the chairs are like in perfect condition.
Yeah, and all the chairs are in perfect condition. But I just wanted to point out that there is wiring that runs along the center of this ceiling here. And that is most likely what propagated the energy that only burned, I'd say maybe a 2-inch line there.
So the idea would be that the directed energy weapon comes into contact with the building and it like activates down that line where the wire is, and that started a fire there, but not to the rest of the building.
Yeah, anywhere that the microwaves will strike metals, those metals will actually propagate the energy. So the microwaves will induce eddy currents to the metals, and these currents will travel through the wiring. And I have actually seen this, like say in Brazil, there was a do video that shows like the electrical power lines being struck, and you can see the smoke kind of travel through the power lines as they heat up really quickly. This all probably took place in a matter of seconds, actually. But yeah, the video clip that I don't have handy, but from Brazil, you can see that it reaches one of the transformers, and then it stops, but then the transformer blows, and then the rest of the power line goes along with it, which shows that like the transformer was, was holding back that energy temporarily until it became overloaded or overwhelmed. And then the energy was able to jump to the remaining part of the power line. Now, what appears to have happened here is that maybe only one end of the building was struck, and the electromagnetic induction only reached to about the middle of the structure, because the other half of the structure appears intact. And so it looks like, due to the inverse square law, the radiative heat actually didn't reach very far, and nor did the electromagnetic induction travel all the way through the wire, at least to the point of causing damage to the other end of the building.
And were there fires next to that church, like nearby, like that would signal that this weapon was being used? But like you said, it maybe only kind of touched this building.
So this church was located in the Waihekuli neighborhood of Lahaina, and that area actually did burn but the block around this particular church was not as affected. And this is, I believe, the north end of the church that was affected. And I think it was maybe the northeast or northwest corner of that block was adjacent to a block that was like fully engulfed. But the block that this church was on was relatively untouched. So what I think is perhaps the adjacent block that was on fire, this, or being targeted, may have actually caught the edge or this building. I'm not sure whether that was intentional or unintentional, but it did also cause collateral damage to the building as well. All right. And then another thing that I wanted to point out was that we see trees that actually burn from the inside out. Now, normally when a tree catches fire, it'll catch fire from the outside and then burn to the inside because fires need fuel. So fuel would be the combustive materials, but also air. And so where the air meets the fuel is usually on the outside. However, we've seen many times in these fires, not just Maui, but several other places, where the tree will actually catch fire on the inside and burn from the inside out. And that's because of the way the microwaves interact with water molecules. Now, water is a polar molecule, which has a positively charged side and a negatively charged side. And so it is affected by electromagnetic frequencies. And so when you have microwave oscillations of approximately 2.5 billion cycles per second, it's going to cause the water molecules that are affected by it to also either oscillate or rotate at that same frequency of about 2.5 gigahertz. So yeah, water molecules, when they do that, will create tons of friction, a lot of friction, which will heat up the water itself and anything nearby. Now, the weird thing is that, this has burned to like a black char on the inside. However, the inside of a tree is relatively airtight. And so it's some sort of weird, smoldering process that takes place inside the tree until it reaches the outside of the tree. And then you see combustive flames will sometimes erupt.
And we're also seeing the flame, it starts at the base or the trunk of the tree, which is abnormal. Usually like the branches and the drier parts will attract the fire and then it goes closer. But this is the opposite. The fire comes from the base and the trunk and the inner parts, and then it kind of goes from there.
Right. Yeah. And I do believe that's also due to the electrical nature of the induction that takes place. So microwaves will induce electrical currents to take place. And there may even also be like a plasma aspect to this direct energy because, like I said, the laser itself will ionize the air around it, and that does create a conductive pathway. And any conductive pathway from high up in the atmosphere that does reach the ground, there will be an electric differential, like between charge, whether it's a positive charge and a negative charge, or just a low negative charge to a high negative charge. There's going to be like a gradient that takes place along that conductive pathway. And so there could be some aspect of electrical equilibrium taking place at the point where it reaches ground, because electricity does always try to go to the ground and it seeks the lowest point. And so that's probably why a lot of the times we do see the tree where it touches the ground will be burned. Now, I also see this with metal fences and signposts and things like that. The point where they touch the ground, you'll have like a little ring of fire around that contact point, but then nowhere else. And to me, that's also a sign of electromagnetic induction. All right.
Yeah, this
and
is
then
really interesting stuff, man. So these now all the photos were like the ones you just showed, and before that, these are from Lahaina. These are from Maui.
This is from Lahaina. Yeah, that one's from Lahaina. That's Lahaina. And then this is also Lahaina here. This is an area of Lahaina that I believe is in the southern end of Lahaina near Puamana. And we can see like one of those cul-de-sacs here with houses all around it. And the houses are completely ashed into like white ash, basically. You don't usually see so much white ashes. And then you do see some darker areas, but these are, where the trees were. And some of the trees even still have their leaves. One thing I wanted to point out is that the palm trees up here near the shoreline, they actually still have their palm fronds on them. And palm fronds are some of the most flammable of the leaves, along with eucalyptus and bay leaves. You can pretty much light those with a cigarette lighter and they would go right up. So the fact that those are still relatively intact while everything else is burned is also suspicious, in my opinion. We have seen lots of leaves and shrubbery and stuff that was dried out but not burned. And to me, that's looks like desiccation due to microwave radiation. All right, and let's see.
I have
here.
a question, Shane.
Yeah.
Or for both of you, actually. Have either of you? So I think my audience could be familiar with like the LRAD sound system and different forms of millimeter waves and waves that have been used as a weapon in another form, but like let's say crowd control. And people will either report hearing things, feeling things, etc. whenever those are sort of placed at them. Is there anybody who described things like that who, they noticed fires are going on and they were feeling weird things or hearing weird things, anything like that?
Yeah, I did want to mention I've spoken to a lot of victims and people that escaped, and I know someone got a sunburn, like their skin was, I don't know, like it seemed like it was getting burned. Also, people were getting kind of confused, and it's like they couldn't really think straight. I mean, I know it was a very stressful situation, but people did have like cognitive and like they're having a difficult time thinking straight. Was there anything else?
Yeah, well, so one of the survivors that we interviewed, he did mention that it almost seemed like there was like an electricity in the air, and he said the vibe was just off. Like everybody was acting weird that day. So there may have been more side effects that happened from the microwave frequencies, or there could have been more side effects from other types of directed energy as well.
All right, and then Jeff said that there was some sort of static. It felt like the air was like static.
Like a static electricity, I think is the way he described it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So we've got you for about maybe another 10, 15 minutes here or so. And I know that there's still a smart cities angle to cover as well. But before we go there, I know you had some more information you wanted to share, right? Some other slides you wanted to share, Shane?
Well, that was everything I had that dealt with directed energy. And then I also have some to do with weather modification, as well as like the UN smart city agenda and stuff. But
sure. Well, then let's
I
go
think
into
we
that.
only have Traci for maybe the next 10 minutes,
10 minutes
or so. And then I can probably go over if necessary.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
let's start with the weather modification angle, either one of you, because I know y'all have mentioned a couple of times like winds being involved. Obviously, winds help propel fires, and this discussion of hurricane and the different mainstream version of events. But were there odd, abnormalities and things being reported about the wind?
Yeah, so we heard about that in Lahaina, and I have pictures of the winds. And I was in LA when the LA fires happened, and I was able to experience this kind of, well, they said it was Santa Ana winds, which normally aren't super strong. Santa Ana winds don't usually have 80-mile-an-hour gusts. And that was what was happening in LA. And I have reports and video of that happening in Lahaina, like these like really strong gusts will come out of nowhere. Also, there was reports of a white haze in the air the days before the fire started. And luckily, there was someone that was monitoring the satellite imagery right before, during, and after the fire. And we caught those planar waves. So I don't think we have video, but we've seen this many times after, but it looks like the clouds are lined up. And that's also evidence of scalar technology. And the clouds are usually perpendicular to the direction of the wind, which is kind of a consistent thing we've been seeing, going forward.
So what's
that perfectly aligned? It perfectly aligns to the plans that were put together before the fire. So it burned exactly where they needed, a couple of outliers. But, immediately after the fire, the governor is on record saying that the state is looking to acquire this land. And even with LA, the governor, right away says that I'm talking to the governor from Hawaii to, find out ways that we can, basically take this land to get redeveloped. And that's something we see going forward. So that's why this one is such an important event, because it is so obvious. I mean, you can look at the overhead view and see exactly where it burned, and that's exactly where they have their plans to, make all these changes.
Yeah, and I know this ties into the sort of UN rewilding and smart city plans. Before we get further into that, if you guys had to sum up, and I don't know if this is in the book, again, I want to encourage everybody to pick up the book, but if you had to sum up, like we've talked, Shane, about directed energy weapons, lasers, microwaves, also talking about weather modification, scalar waves, things to do with the clouds. How do these things connect together? Like, is in your mind, are the scalar waves a sign of the directed energy weapon being used, or is there two things going on at once? Like, how would you guys sum up the general thesis of what you believe may have happened?
So I'll let Shane go into a little bit more detail. I think I lost him, but there is something about electrifying the air, and it also goes into the spraying of the air that we see these, airplanes putting up. But there is something, and I don't fully understand this, maybe Shane could elaborate more, but there is some sort of need to generate some sort of energy through the use of geoengineering, the spraying, and also there's often a storm nearby when these happen. I don't fully understand that, but it's not, I think we've been kind of brainwashed into thinking what a laser is and what they're capable of, and like something comes around and just shoots things. I don't see that as, now that I've studied this, I don't see that as what is happening. I feel like there has to be a coordinated effect from different aspects of weather control and directed energy in order for things to work out this way. So there is another aspect that I'm not fully, I don't fully grasp, but hopefully at some point I will. But I don't know, Shane, do you understand that? Like that energy that is kind of built up through wind and the spraying.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I disconnected there and I came back and was trying to figure out what you guys were talking about exactly. So,
my question just real quick, Shane, was like, if you
go
guys
ahead.
had to sum up from each of your perspectives, like what would be your general thesis of what may have happened? Like, how did the laser, the microwaves, scalar waves, spraying, how does that all, come together? Is there one thing going on? Is there multiple things going on?
Oh, I believe it's definitely multiple things. So the wind, in my opinion, that day was also artificially generated. And I believe that that's a property there. So there's something called electric wind or ionic wind, which is wind that can be generated by electric charges. You may have seen something like that with those bladeless fans that they have on the market now, that they can actually push the wind just using electric charge, or it's like a kind of like static electricity, but not. And it's a similar phenomenon that takes place when you create something called electric wind or ionic wind. So we have, you've probably heard that the NEXRAD Doppler radar towers are capable of weather modification, and I believe that the way that they do that is by creating these interference patterns, like Traci said, called planar waves. So these phased arrays can actually create these constructive interference patterns that produce these linear waves that spread out but they're perpendicular to the direction of travel. And so we've actually seen these show up in the clouds before, like in Maui. I was going to try to screen share, but for some reason I'm having like a glitch with it right now. When I ever go to screen share, it's grayed out. So I'm unable to do that currently. However, if you were to see these lines, like these parallel lines of clouds in the sky that look almost like mini blinds or fish bones, the meteorologists have called those gravity wave clouds. That's the actual term for them, is atmospheric gravity wave clouds. And at first I thought that was maybe a misnomer, but then when I started looking into it more, scalar and gravity are somewhat connected. And a lot of times these waves are standing still. So you'll see the clouds move through this pattern while the pattern stays stationary, but the clouds themselves are moving. And those are indicative of standing waves, which I do believe may actually be scalar in nature. And so there's microwave technology being used, there's laser technology being used, and I do also believe that there's scalar technology being used. And now the microwave and the scalar might be involved in creating electric or ionic wind, but then there's also laser and microwave energy being used to ignite the fires as well. And so when you combine, the fire and the wind, you just basically have like a perfect storm, if you will. Especially if you shut off the water, you don't turn on the alarms, and you don't send in the Coast Guard or FEMA right away. things
and
like
then
that.
also, like with Dane Weggington's research, the particles being sprayed will settle and cause fires to be more intense, more fast moving. And we're hearing that, like,
strontium and barium and
aluminum oxide is a very strong desiccant, and it could also be an accelerant, but it also is conductive. Aluminum will interact with microwaves very strongly. And so I believe that the aluminum oxide, especially in the stratospheric aerosol injection, also known as chemtrails, is possibly behind that.
Right. So it's a lot of different
Yeah, that's somewhat where I kind of had believed things were headed, and these different incidents. And it's interesting because when you guys had me on your show, we talked a little bit briefly about how this applies to 9/11 and some of the different aberrations people have seen in pictures, not just buildings collapsing, but cars being burnt in a similar manner, things being burnt near each other, but then other things being left alone. Just to go back and a little deeper into the research on this stuff, do either of you believe the theory that HAARP is also related to this sort of technology and weather modification or creating these sort of events?
Absolutely. So like HAARP was kind of one of the early versions of phased array technology. It was a large phased radio array, basically, is what it was. And nowadays they have more compact transmitters. They are, just as, I believe HAARP was at maybe 10 to at least 10 megawatts or something. I'm not sure what the upper limit was, but we have equipment now like the C-based X-band radar transmitters, which is a mobile radar transmitter that looks like kind of like a big golf ball on a tee almost. And that was actually seen in the Honolulu harbor right after the Maui fires. Now, these large phased arrays, like the SBX transmitter, I think it can transmit at over like 22 or 23 megawatts, which is a lot of power. A small city would use about 1 megawatt of power, actually. So these are very strong transmitters that are phased array transmitters that are capable of beam forming and beam steering. And so, yes, they can do all of that same stuff that HAARP used to do, but it's more mobile. It's more mobile now. And so they don't necessarily have to have a land-based transmitter like HAARP because they have mobile transmitters like the SBX.
And then one thing I want to mention just before we wrap up, because we didn't get into this, but Shane wrote a very elaborate, very amazing section of the book about the military activity that went on. And it's a lot of information, but we do have pictures of nuclear subs off the coast of Lahaina right before the fire. There is that massive HAARP dome, and also a lot of military choppers and things that happened that it's kind of hard to explain what they were exactly doing.
Well, you guys got so much in the book. Again, I definitely want to recommend everybody picking it up because I'm looking at the chapters right now, and we definitely didn't get to cover everything here. But I did want to give you guys a chance to address. I'm looking at chapter 14, and it says an urgent message to the people and tourists of Maui. And what is that message? What would you offer here, sort of in closing, as far as like where are things at now with Lahaina? Do the people still need help? Do they need support? Have the governments moved in to start trying to buy that land? Is the smart cities and development, where are things at now, and what would you say to people who might
I do think they were hoping to have things move a lot faster, but because of the attention, guys, but I think they've been having a hard time getting things off the ground. There has been a lot of outrage as far as what has happened to the people there, what happened to their property. A lot of the homeowners could not afford to rebuild, or a lot of them were renters, so they just lost everything and they didn't have ownership to their property. But there was a big effort to get them off the island to the mainland, and the people that are staying, they built like these like chicken coop type housing. They call it workforce housing because they do need people to be there to, rebuild, to work the new city. And I do believe they are going to try to bring tourism back, but the economy has taken a major hit. So I wouldn't say, don't go there, because a lot of people that are still there are working, 2-3 jobs at a resort, a restaurant. And if they don't have any business, then they're really going to be in an even worse situation than they are. So I would say, still support the community and still go there if you do want to. And the people there are really suffering. And Just so many horrible stories that we've heard of suicide and entire families being wiped out. And a lot of those people, and especially the children, have not even been recognized. They're not even considered part of the death count, and a lot of their names will never be known. So that is a big motivating force for me, is because if we forget about this, then that's like, hundreds of innocent people, a lot of them children, that will never know their names or will never be recognized. So.
Yeah, it's very powerful, and I appreciate that, and I think that it's just because of the world we live in, there's constantly one seeming disaster or conflict or something going on. So it's very easy for people to forget about things that have happened just even in the last couple of years. And I think even in the bigger picture, questioning events like this and digging deeper into them helps us look elsewhere and start to understand other world events that might not be what we have been told. Shane, any other thoughts you have as far as like the current state of things, and maybe any closing thoughts on what people should know about the book?
Well, I guess to transition from your previous question, we have been kind of trying to keep up with what's been going on in Maui, and they had introduced legislation to try to finalize, because we have slowed them down a little bit when it comes to implementing the smart city and so forth. They had a bill called Senate Bill 3381 that was introduced into the Hawaii legislation. It was trying to create this Lele district out of the West Maui, the western side of Maui, which would basically put a 9-person panel in charge of everything that took place there. And so that it involves like the redevelopment and everything that goes on. And so that bill was actually, we brought attention to that, and there was people who showed up to testify against it, and there was a lot of pushback against it. And it eventually didn't pass, and it was, dead. It died in that legislative session, and they might try to bring it up again soon, but it has been somewhat postponed. And so they haven't been able to do everything they've wanted to do. However, we kind of hoped that, we would be able to prevent it more than we have been. It looks like there's various factors at play with, cognitive dissonance and so forth on the island of Maui. People have a hard time, not only believing that, the government would do that to them, but they also don't know what they can do about it. Right. And so, we've discovered a lot of, resistance just to the idea of the truth behind this. But also when people do wake up to the truth, they do feel like perhaps a little bit disempowered. However, we have slowed down the process in Maui, and there was also a smart city which was defeated in Perez Zeledon, Costa Rica, because they got wind of it early. They showed up to the meetings and they voiced their opposition. And when there's overwhelming opposition by the public to something like this, it does usually cause the local politicians to think twice about supporting it. So we have defeated a smart city in Costa Rica. We've slowed down the smart city in Maui, but it's not completely defeated yet. So we do need a lot more awareness, attention, and action to take place to prevent this from happening in Maui and elsewhere.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great to hear about the victories that do happen. And I think we need to, share those more often, because sometimes people do get disheartened and think that it's just one loss after one loss after one loss. And even when there's small victories, it's important to recognize them and all the people who put in that effort. And that's an important issue to me, because I'm originally from Houston, which declared itself the first smart city in the US back in 2017, 2018. And there was, no public announcement. And unfortunately, my efforts to get any sort of resistance were, very, just in a city that big, people are just either not paying attention, or they think, yeah, driverless cars, all the wonderful things they're promising, that's the future I want. So It's great to hear there is some pushback. And the website, again, everybody, is themauibook.com. It'll be in the show notes if you want to check that out. And Shane, both of you, feel free to send me anything else you'd like in the notes as far as resources and things people can look into. I think this is a really important topic. It's not only important because of where it happened in a population that is already dealing with other issues that have just been compounded over generations, but because it does apply to other areas. And the next time we're told that there's a fire, whether it's in California or even fires that have been happening across Texas recently that make me a little bit, curious about what's going on, we have to look at them with a skeptical eye and at least be willing to ask these questions, because if we don't, then, well, we know where we're going to be headed. We're going to be pushed further into the world that is not the direction we want to go. The world of technocracy and smart cities and control grids. And yeah, it's all being done, of course, using the climate change narrative. So this is really, really important work that you guys are doing. Just any final thoughts from either of you before we wrap up?
No, thank you so much, Derek, for having us on. And again, my main goal from the beginning was to keep this story alive, to keep the people of Maui in people's memories and not forget about this. And I'm really proud of the fact that Maui is kind of the blueprint. Like whenever someone talks about these unusual weather events, Maui is the first thing that comes out of their mouth. And so I'm just really happy that this has been used as an example. And I think this is the best example with the most evidence. And I really hope people will keep that in mind going forward, because there's a good chance something like this will happen to the area that you're in. And that's it.
Yeah. And I would say that, knowledge is power and knowing is half the battle. And so we need to try to educate ourselves, not only on like these, the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, but as well as these smart cities, and also, directed energy and weather warfare as well. So there are some things that we can do to defend ourselves against these. I didn't get to go into the blue thing, but the blue thing is a real phenomenon. And, also Faraday cages as well. So you could potentially build a Faraday cage and paint it blue, and that would be a good step in the right direction. However, we need to spread the awareness, basically. So once, I know about things and I tell you guys can tell other people about these things. And then once the awareness is at, like, say, a critical threshold, then we might be in a position to actually prevent these from getting worse.
One last thing, Brush Junkie is the YouTube channel that we have, and we have about 150 videos on this topic. So if you want to hear more, you can go there.
I will definitely send everybody there. All right. Thank you guys both for joining me today, for breaking this down for me. I can't say I've been too surprised by what you've shared, but it is very important to know the details, because, we understand the possibilities that exist. We also understand the people who are trying to, take the world in a certain direction have no problem with committing crimes, with killing, with murder, with lying. And so we shouldn't put anything past them. Everybody at home, please do check the show notes, follow these folks here, pick up the book, watch their videos, continue to ask questions. And until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.